Good afternoon and welcome to the IISS-US, the Washington home of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. My name is Bryce Campbell. I'm the Managing Director of the office here. And we are here today to launch a very special publication, Beyond Air-Sea Battle, the debate over U.S. military strategy in Asia, which is the latest of our Adelphi book series. And we are joined by the book's author, Dr. Aaron Friedberg, as well as Elbridge Colby, as a discussant. I mentioned this book is unique, and that is not just for its rich analysis of military policy options for the U.S. in Asia, but also in the fact that it was launched in conjunction with our Shangri-La dialogue this year. The SLD, as we call it on the inside, is the Institute's longest-running major dialogue. This was its 13th year, and this is the first time we've launched publications alongside the conference, which I think everyone who was there would admit was a bit more spirited than usual, which was great, but was definitely enriched by not only the publication of this book, but also the strategic dossier that was launched that weekend as well. Regional Security Assessment 2014, Key Developments in Transit Asia Pacific Security. Members of the IISS will know about this, should have received their copies of the Adelphi. Copies of both publications are available for sale. Members interested in additional copies of the Adelphi do receive a 20% discount, as well as on the dossier. Those of you interested in membership, there's information as always at the back of the room. Important business out of the way. I'd like to introduce our speakers, which is why you're really here. Dr. Aaron Friedberg is Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University, where he has taught since 1987, and co-director of the Woodrow Wilson School's Center for International Security Studies. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the George Marshall Fund of the United States. In 2001 to 2002, Friedberg was selected as the first occupant of the Henry A. Kissinger Chair at the Library of Congress. He has also been a research fellow at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, the Norwegian Nobel Institute, the Smithsonian Institution's Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and Harvard University Center for International Affairs. Dr. Friedberg served from June 2003 to June 2005 as Deputy Assistant for National Security Affairs and Director of Policy Planning in the Office of the Vice President. After leaving government, he was appointed to the Defense Policy Board and the Secretary of State's Advisory Committee on Democracy Promotion. Joining him will be Elbridge Colby, who is the Robert M. Gates Fellow at the Center for a New American Security, where he focuses on strategic deterrence, nuclear weapons, conventional force, intelligence, and related issues. He previously served as principal analyst and division lead for global strategic affairs at the Center for Naval Analysis and in the U.S. government, including as policy advisor to the Secretary of Defense's representative for the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, and as an expert advisor to the Congressional Strategic Posture Commission, as a staff member of the President's Commission on the Intelligence Capabilities of the U.S. regarding WMD, with the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq, and with the State Department. Colby also serves, or has served, as consultant to a variety of U.S. government entities on a range of defense and intelligence matters. So we are spoiled by the collective expertise, and I've actually checked. We had a harder time editing down your bios than our staff did editing the manuscript for this book. One final piece of housekeeping before we get started. Aaron will give about 10 to 15 minutes of remarks about the book, followed by 5 to 10 minutes of response from Colby, and then we'll turn it over to you for Q&A. So with that, I turn it over to Dr. Friedberg.
Thank you very much, Bryce, and thanks to all of you for coming in on a beautiful, unusually nice July afternoon in Washington for this, and thanks especially to Bridge for taking part. I'm delighted that he's able to be here. I regard him as one of the most thoughtful people writing on these issues, so I'm delighted that he was able to take the time to join me here. 10 or 15 minutes, there's nothing harder than talking in 10 or 15 minutes about a book that you have recently completed. As time goes by, it gets easier, but the closer you are to it, the harder and harder it is to see what's really important. So what I would like to do is just to give a brief overview of the book, talk very briefly about the three principal parts, then just a little bit about what's at the core of it, which is this debate and a few key points, I think, from that discussion. discussion as it stands now, in my view. So the three principal parts of the book are first talking about this emerging challenge of what are referred to generally as China's anti-access aerial denial capabilities. And the key point for me, and this I guess reflects my instincts as an historian, is that in order to really understand what's going on now, we have to actually go back not just to the 1990s, but to the 1970s. That the Chinese capabilities, which are now keeping American defense planners awake at night, although not as many of them and not as long as they should be, are in fact a reaction to an American development set of capabilities that were a response to the development of Soviet capabilities in the late 1970s. So you have Soviet capabilities developing in the 70s, an American response to those, which begins in the 70s and really begins to take shape in the 1990s, and then a Chinese reaction to the American capabilities that begins in the 90s and continues today. And basically, as I describe in the book, I think the Chinese, beginning at the end of the Cold War, and certainly in the early 1990s, especially in the aftermath of the First Gulf War, began to study very carefully what it was that the United States had been doing, and they basically came to the conclusion that the United States had done what the Soviets talked about, but never in fact did themselves, which is to build what the Soviets used to refer to as a reconnaissance strike complex, or we're in the process of building a reconnaissance strike complex, a combination of sensors, command and control and communication systems, and precision strike weapons that enable the U.S. to hit at a wide variety of targets, fixed and mobile targets, using conventional weapons with high precision, and with, from the Chinese perspective, very worrisome implications for Chinese security. And so we see, in retrospect, and it was visible actually to a surprising degree at the time, a wide-ranging discussion among Chinese experts about the implication of these capabilities and about what was going to be necessary to respond to them. And very simply, the answer that was arrived at was that in order to defeat or defend against a reconnaissance strike complex, it was necessary for China to build it itself. China, too, needed to acquire these sensors, communication systems, and precision strike weapons in order to counter the American capacity to project military power into the Western Pacific, something which the United States had been able to do virtually without challenge, certainly since the demise of the Soviet Union. And what followed from that analysis was then a very methodical and still ongoing process of constructing capabilities that filled out the various dimensions of this notional reconnaissance strike complex that Chinese analysts identified as necessary going back to the early 1990s. And this process of construction is a work in progress. It's not finished. The Chinese are further along in some areas than others. But what's striking, I think, in looking back, is just how methodical they've been and how clear it was, in retrospect, what it was that they were going to try to do. And the implications of these developing so-called anti-access area denial capabilities have, I think, begun to sink in the United States, the American strategic community. There were some inklings of this going back to the early and mid-1990s. But for reasons that I'll come to in a minute, it took a rather long time for us to come to grips with what this was all about and what it implied. The implications, I think, are as follows. First, that U.S. and allied forces and facilities, bases, fixed and now also mobile, are increasingly vulnerable to attack at greater and greater ranges with conventional weapons fired from a variety of different platforms by China. So this vulnerability is growing, and it's growing rather sharply. Related to this, from an American perspective, the potential costs of intervening in a conflict or confrontation in the Western Pacific in which China would be the adversary are rising. It's not that they didn't exist before, but if you go back 20 years, China's capacity to do damage to the United States was very limited, and it has grown considerably, and the costs potentially to the United States of having to be engaged in a confrontation with China are rising. That fact, in turn, I think, is beginning to raise questions about the credibility of American security guarantees. And I'll come back to this, because to me, that's really the nub, the heart of the matter. In addition, what the Chinese have been doing, I think it's now increasingly recognized, is pursuing a path, an asymmetric path, which is imposing significant costs on the United States. As the U.S. contemplates how to respond, it turns out that although we were the ones talking about long-term strategies and competitive strategies and so on, it's the Chinese, in fact, who have been implementing these ideas directed at us. They've been developing relatively inexpensive weapons in many cases, which threaten extremely expensive platforms and capabilities of the United States. And responding to this is a challenge, and it's going to be a costly challenge. And finally, and not insignificantly, of course, that these changes in the balance are increasing the risk of deterrence failure. That it is now possible, I think, to imagine a wider range of contingencies in which the United States and China might come to blows, in which, in particular, China might initiate a conflict with the United States than would have been conceivable 20 or 30 years ago. It's not to say that this is likely, but the risks, I think, are growing. And they're related also to issues of perception, which I don't have time to talk about here, but how we view the balance and how China views the balance may be quite different. And that gap, if there is one, if it opens, particularly if the Chinese are more optimistic about their capabilities than we are, is a classic formula for miscalculation and deterrence failure. So that's the first part of the book. Secondly, I won't dwell on this, although I find it particularly interesting, is for me, the puzzling question of why the United States has taken so long to respond in a concerted way. And I think you could argue that we haven't yet fully done that. And I know people disagree with this and say, well, we were thinking about this 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and so on, and that's true. But given the seriousness of the challenge, the level and seriousness of the response on the part of the United States, and here I'm talking initially about the intellectual response, is surprisingly limited. Now, there is a date, I think, at which we can identify the emergence of this public debate, and that's the announcement of the RC Battle, the concept paper in the RC Battle office, so it dates the late 2011. Of course, people were talking about this before that, but not that much before in a serious way. And there are a variety of different explanations for this. I think future historians may be interested in this question. I hope not because they're trying to explain how a conflict between the United States and China broke out. But there were intelligence failures. High-ranking U.S. officials have said in recent years in public statements that U.S. intelligence estimates of Chinese military capabilities were off by a significant amount for a significant period of time. That's really quite a remarkable thing for such people to say. Usually they're civilian masters that all our children are above average and all our estimates are right on the mark. So to say we were wrong, underestimated, is, I think, I take it as a cry for help. But it's not just that. It's not just a question of identifying the dots. I think there have been conceptual failures or shortcomings, difficulty on the part of many on our side to understand what it is that the Chinese were up to, even though they were talking fairly openly about it. And Tom Mencken, who, if he hasn't left yet, okay, so Tom's here so I can say a nice thing about Tom. I'll wait till you leave to say the other stuff. In his writings about how the United States in particular, but how countries generally assess the military capabilities of emerging rivals, points out that historically in the United States, the tendency to be quite slow in recognizing the emergence of capabilities and concepts of operation that are different from our own. So military organizations recognize the things that they do and think are important, and they tend to overlook or to downplay the significance of things that look unfamiliar. And I suspect many of you have had similar conversations with some of you, I'm sure, are military officers, but certainly have in the last 10 years, where if you got into a discussion about China's capabilities, the answer was, but their top-line fighter plane is 4th generation and ours is 5th generation, and they just fielded a carrier. It was a kind of head-to-head comparison of ours against theirs, rather than looking at these rather unusual asymmetric techniques that the Chinese were developing to counter our power projection capabilities. So there is a conceptual issue. Distraction, if you look back at the second QDR, which was published in September of 2001, there is a very detailed discussion of the A2AD challenge all of its aspects and the various possible ways in which the United States might respond to it. Now that part of that document has an interesting history. In fact, of course, the QDR that year had to be pulled back at the very last minute because of September 11th and modified to make reference to the then obviously very pressing problem of international terrorism. If not for 9/11, I would hazard a guess that that portion of the QDR would have been the blueprint for Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld's attempts to transform the U.S. military. Of course, it didn't happen. There were other things that had to be dealt with, and although we didn't stop thinking and worrying about this problem, much less intellectual energy was devoted to it than would have been the case otherwise, if not for 9/11, the subsequent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. There are other issues, I think, that have acted as constraints, some of them a little bit more complex. If you take the problem seriously, or at least if you interpret it in the way that I do and some others do, the reactions or the responses from the U.S. to these emerging Chinese capabilities may not be the ones that the services would naturally prefer. So if aircraft carriers are increasingly vulnerable to hypersonic cruise missiles and ballistic missiles and so on, the answer may not be to build bigger aircraft carriers. It may be to do something totally different. Similarly, if bases in the region are vulnerable, the answer to the problem may not be to buy more relatively short-range fighter aircraft, but to develop unmanned vehicles, stealthy vehicles based on longer range, and so on. So there wasn't exactly enthusiasm, I think, for embracing this problem. And this, just as a footnote, as an academic, I had a hard time persuading my colleagues that people in the Pentagon don't spend all of their time sitting and looking around for the next big threat, and they can't wait to get into a competition with China, can't wait to get into a war with China. Nothing could be further than the truth in this instance. I think to the contrary. There's been a tendency to say that we don't really want to deal with that problem. We want to keep on doing what we've been doing. There are political constraints, the whole notion that if you talk about China as a threat, make it a threat as if you didn't, it wouldn't be. And last but not least, and very significantly now, of course, financial constraints. Again, in retrospect, I think two black swans play a very important role in this story. The first is September 11th, which deflected the United States from a more serious focus on the emergence of these Chinese capabilities. And the second is the financial crisis, which begins in 2008, just at the moment when I think overall the U.S. military was beginning to turn away from counterinsurgency and to begin to look seriously at the problem of high-end conventional warfare against a peer competitor. Just at that moment, the financial crisis hits. The third part of the book, and really the second half, is devoted to the debate. And I won't rehearse all of the different parts of it here, but at least in my attempt to identify and categorize the different people contributing to this, and it's always nice to be the one putting people in boxes instead of being put in them yourself. So whether you like it or not, I put you in one of these boxes. Well, obviously there are a wide range of views, but in my mind, there are two broad variants on the table. One is what I refer to as the direct approach as a response to China's 8288 capabilities, and the other are a couple of what I call, borrowing from Basil Hart, indirect approaches. And the direct approach is essentially embodied in so-called air sea battle concept. The idea is we have to go directly against this developing reconnaissance strike complex and to disable it using various means in order to maintain our capacity to project power into the Western Pacific under any and all circumstances. Because of discontent with that idea, some of it well-founded and some of it perhaps based on misunderstanding or misperceptions, another family of alternative strategies has emerged, and I refer to these as the indirect approach, and I break that down into two categories. And these are ideas put forward by various people who say, we don't want to attack the Chinese man, where it's very dangerous for us to try to engage directly and dismantle and disarm China's 8288 capabilities. We should be looking for other ways to impose our will that don't carry these potential dangers. One is to impose a so-called distant blockade, so to stand off at a long distance, presumably at various choke points, and to interdict and cut off flows, particularly of energy, into the waters off China's coasts. And the other is this idea of maritime denial or offshore control, which is a more aggressive form of maritime strategy that, in the view of many people who have proposed it, would be a more effective warfighting approach, and therefore presumably also a more effective deterrent, but which would also allow the U.S. to forego strikes against the Chinese mainland. It would involve a lot of undersea activity, and would essentially be aimed at denying China the use of the waters immediately off its shores out to the first island chain and beyond for any purpose, not just interdicting energy, but also attacking, presumably sinking surface vessels, both commercial and military. As I said, I won't try to summarize the debate, as my kids used to say when they were writing book reviews. If you want to find out what happens, read the book. So if you want to find out what happens, you have to read the book. But let me just suggest 4 key points, conclusions that I draw from this. One, and it's so obvious that it has to be repeated, the absence of a clearly articulated strategy is a serious problem for us. And I have to say I'm getting more and more, this may be old age, more and more frustrated and unhappy with American military officials who say, in effect, oh, don't worry about this, we've got it under control. We can't tell you how we're going to deal with this because it's so super secret, but it would really work well. And just go back doing what you're doing. That is not a satisfactory answer. It's not satisfactory in part because it's not persuasive. It's not persuasive not only to me, it's not persuasive to our allies, and I suspect it's not persuasive to the Chinese either. Our position in Asia rests on our alliances. Our alliances rest on military commitments, which ultimately take the form of promises to come to the aid of our allies in the event that they are threatened or coerced or attacked by others. And in order to do that, we have to have a plausible strategy, one that we believe in, or at least can act like we believe in, and one that we can articulate. Look at the Cold War. Well, we weren't sure that flexible response was really going to work, but it was a story we could tell, and it was clear what it was that we intended. So we need a strategy, and I think going on much longer without being able to do that is going to be very problematic. One reason in particular that I think this is likely to be so is that in a democracy, you cannot justify the expenditures necessary to sustain the kind of strategy that I think we're going to pursue unless you can tell Congress and the American people what it is you're doing and why you're doing it. And I realize this creates all kinds of sensitivities, but at some point, some American political and military leaders are going to have to find ways of saying, we don't hate China, we don't regard China as an enemy, we are not looking for a war with China, but China, through its actions, is shifting the military balance in this region in ways that are deleterious to our interests and threatening to our allies, and we need to respond, and here's how we're going to do it. So that's point number one. Point number two, I think a lot of the discussion or debate about these alternative strategies has tended to focus on one or other, actually of 2 criteria for evaluating alternative strategies, and really the discussion should be broader. I think there are 4. The first one, the most obvious one, is deterrence. The question really is, obviously we don't want to fight a war, so how is it, how likely is it, and through what mechanism that the development of a particular strategy will discourage China from ever initiating armed conflict with the United States. Number 2, and this one has tended to get the most, I think, attention in the professional writing about this topic, is the question about warfighting. So how would this unfold? What would be the military results? It's rather limited even in that sense, because really the question here is, what's the theory of victory? How are you going to win this conflict? One issue related to the problem of warfighting, which has gotten a disproportionate amount of attention, is not because it's unimportant, but just in relation to everything else, is the issue of escalation. And in fact, I think for many people, this ends the discussion, ends the debate, or rules out entirely certain possibilities. The notion that if we were to strike China with conventional weapons in conflict, it would lead automatically to nuclear escalation, and this, because of the terrible outcome, precludes our discussing or preparing for that kind of operation. I don't think that the answer is that simple, and maybe we can talk about that. So that's the second criteria. But there are 2 others. The third is, what is the impact or likely impact on the subsequent stages of the long-term continuing military competition between China and the United States of pursuing one avenue or another? And I refer you back to the fundamental work of Andy Marshall on long-term strategic competitions in the 1970s. The fact is, whether we like it or not, we are engaged in a military rivalry and competition with China. It is likely, if we're lucky, to go on for quite some time. And the object of the exercise is not going to be to bring it to a halt, because we probably can't, but to cause it to move in directions that are more favorable to us and to our allies than to China. And in particular, cause it to move in directions that impose costs on China disproportionate to our actions, rather than being on the receiving end of such actions by the Chinese. So how might these different strategies affect the long-term competition? And the fourth, and finally, and importantly, is reassurance. We're not just talking to ourselves, and we're not just talking to the Chinese. We're very much, whether we like it or realize it or not, talking to our allies, talking both in words and through our deeds. So about each of these strategies, one might ask, is it going to be reassuring to our allies, or is it, to the contrary, going to be frightening to them? The third point, actual strategy, first of all, of course, is going to emerge. Much as it pains me as an academic to say this, it is not going to emerge from pure intellectual debate and take some pristine form. It's going to be shaped by all kinds of parochial considerations, financial considerations, bureaucratic politics, but it is going to have some kind of core that's coherent for reasons I suggested. But it is, I think, going to be a hybrid. It isn't going to be one of these or another. It's going to be some blending. And here it strikes me that some elements of the various strategies that have been laid out are less controversial than others. And in particular, I don't think anyone disagrees that the United States and its allies need to do things. What exactly is, again, gets into the debate, but to reduce the vulnerability of our forward-based forces and control logistics and so on. The development of these long-range conventional precision strike capabilities by China is a real problem, and we're not simply going to up stakes and go home, but what are we going to do to reduce vulnerability? A second element, I think, of a strategy, which is maybe controversial, but to my mind is inescapable, is the fact that the threat of a distant blockade is existential, by which I mean it exists whether we like it or not, because the United States is the dominant maritime power and China believes that it exists. And it may be existential in the sense that it could pose a fundamental threat to the survival of the Chinese regime in the event of conflict. To me, the key issues in the discussion really have to do with what kind of offensive capabilities the U.S. and its allies should acquire, in what quantities and what types, how much long-range conventional precision strike, how much undersea warfare, and so on. Finally, just very briefly, there are a couple of other issues that I think have not been discussed as fully as they should be. One is the role of allies and how allied actions might be better or less well integrated with things that the United States might choose to do, and how our choices about what strategy to pursue and what capabilities to procure might be shaped to some degree by considerations about what allies would do. Last but not least, the topic which I know is near Bridges' heart, and I think is extremely important, is the issue of nuclear weapons. This debate has gone on in kind of an odd, not quite a vacuum, but on the one hand, you have people who say the existence of nuclear weapons means you can't even think about certain things. On the other, you have people saying, assume nuclear weapons out of existence. Let's assume that there's stable mutual deterrence, and then let's play out the conventional conflict and just not worry about escalation. You can't do either of those things. And Bridges is going to tell us why.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks first, Bryce, to the invitation and the kind introduction. It's clear to me that in my next job, I need to have a shorter title. This is getting out of hand. But more importantly, if you don't mind, thank you very much to Aaron for your very generous introduction and kind words. It's really an honor and a delight to be on sitting next to one of the premier strategists of our time, if not the premier strategist. So it's a delight to be here, and I'm a little daunted, especially to have to discuss would be the right word, his work, but I will jump into the breach. Those of you who know me, and a few in the audience know that caution is not always my virtue, so bear with me. But I think in looking at this very important book, this very important contribution, we need to look at the fact that this is an increasingly important debate, and not just for those of us who are aficionados of defense policy and strategy. I don't think it's a conceit to say that this issue of U.S. military strategy in the Asia-Pacific is probably the central military strategic question that faces the United States, and therefore, by extension, those of our allies and the other major power in the world, or putative superpower, which is China. So Aaron's commentary on this is very timely, and I think will really shape the debate. So I really commend this discussion to you and those of you who are interested in it. And the particular question is, that he's addressing, and that the discussion at large addresses, is what does deterrence require? What does U.S. deterrence require? But that's really a code for something much more significant and substantial. And Aaron pointed towards it, but I'll make it explicit, which is, what does deterrence require means what does the United States require in terms of its military capability, posture, and strategy in order to continue to underwrite, if it so desires, the sort of geopolitical order which it has led and shaped since 1945. So this is not something that's just for people who read Aviation Week. This is for people who read foreign affairs and foreign policy, and the New York Times and the Washington Post and Wall Street Journal. So whether or not all of you read the book, I think it's important you at least get a sense of it, what's going on. So I think this is will become the go-to reference in understanding the debate. I also think it makes a number of major contributions in clarifying the conceptual framework. And I particularly appreciate, not just because I'm a little unhealthily interested in nuclear weapons, but I think it's also very useful and makes an important contribution in highlighting the importance of discussing nuclear weapons and problems of nuclear escalation in an intelligent, rational, and explicit way, rather than, as Aaron very well put it just now, either assuming the problem away or kind of taking the problem and then saying it eats up everything else and rules a whole bunch of stuff out. I commend to you all Jan van Tol's excellent report for CSBA a few years ago, and Jan had to grapple with the problem, but he confined the issue to, he said, I assume mutual nuclear deterrence will hold. And Jan will tell you himself that he says that's not because he thinks it's necessarily true, it's because he had to bound the problem, but I think Aaron's, we've gotten to the point where we really need to start thinking about this more explicitly. So my main, I very much agree with Aaron's characterization of the backstory, of the need for a strategy, of the scale and significance of China's military buildup. Where I would differ with him, and it's a relatively minor, but I think significant difference, is in his conceptualization of the debate, which he puts us between a sort of direct approach, in which he puts the sort of air-sea battle concept. Now, sort of point of order is the way air-sea battle is discussed in the broader policy and academic and intellectual world is not quite the same thing as what the Pentagon means. The Pentagon has a more specific sort of Pentagon-y concept of the way forces are operated, procurement ideas. But I think what most of us are talking about when we mean air-sea battle is basically a sort of forward-leaning American military strategy. I mean, you basically can think of it as an attempt to adapt the traditional American way of war, broadly construed, to a very, a more severe and significant military challenge in the People's Republic of China. But so, I think it's important to understand that the Pentagon, when it's talking about air-sea battle, does mean something a little bit different, although I think it basically is pretty cognate. And then Aaron puts in the indirect category these people who talk about offshore control or distant blockade or one of these other things. I think the main point that I would like to really drive home is that I do not think these things are alternatives. The air-sea battle approach, if you read the air-sea battle concept document that was released last year, air-sea battle is basically about maintaining advantage in escalation, basically in the competition over military capability, in order to provide the ability to modulate U.S. responses up and down the ladder of escalation. And let me be clear about this. Basically, the logic is, as I understand it, you want to maintain military superiority, not so that you have to use it, not so that you have to preempt, not so that you have to go downtown, but so that the opponent knows that you can do that, and so that shapes his behavior. right? And so if you read the air sea battle document, it does talk quite explicitly about intermediate escalatory options or more discriminate or tailored options. And I think that that's important to say because I think the opposition to air sea battle caricatures that a little bit and also pretends that these are actually alternatives. Air sea battle is in no way hostile to the idea of blockade. In fact, it may rest upon it. Air sea battle would say you want to have as many options as you possibly can, but it's not realistic to say that we can sign off, we can completely give up on the idea of strikes on the Chinese mainland. I mean, if you, just practically speaking, if the United States were to do that, essentially all of Chinese military power is on the Chinese mainland. So you would basically be giving up the ability to strike the mainland. And Aaron, I think, rightly acknowledges and agrees with that. I don't think we kind of come down in a particularly different place. But I think that what I worry about is that Aaron's conceptualization of this debate feeds the offshore control argument in a way that I don't think is actually quite right, because it's important to understand that air sea battle is trying to maintain the advantage in order to enable us to be able to act in a tailored and discriminate fashion. Now, I think it's actually important to note at this point that one of the things that I think Aaron is contributing to, and that I've tried to do a little bit in my own smaller way, is to get the Pentagon to focus more on this. You know, I think one of the problems that we have, and Aaron talked about this sort of the bureaucratic culture, which I think is absolutely right, is the American way of war of the last 25 years since the end of the Cold War has been, we turn out your lights, we go downtown, we tell you what to do, and you accept it because you have no choice. You know, now when you're dealing with Serbia or sanctioned Iraq, maybe even some of the other rogue states we have to deal with in the last couple of decades, that's maybe a winning proposition. And I've seen this attitude anecdotally in war games, and I know there are a lot of you out there, and Aaron, you yourself, I'm sure, have seen it as well. The problem is that we're now dealing with a fundamentally different situation in which we do need to think a lot more carefully about managing and ideally controlling escalation, about limiting war in a way that enables us to achieve our political objectives while giving the other guy a reason to terminate the conflict as well. And basically, that's going to involve a very substantial change in the way the military does business, potentially also in the way that, you know, the kinds of capabilities we have. And you know, Aaron referred to some of the unmanned capabilities. I mean, there's going to be a lot of sort of broken bureaucratic and cultural China. I mean, the Air Force was taken over, for instance, by tactical air fighters. You know, real guys with gusto. You know, the sort of Top Gun model. You know, Navy, but you get the idea. You know, this is a different kind of attitude. This is a much more, you know, high tech. You know, very flexible sort of, you know, a different kind of way of war and way of ideally of deterrence than we have before. So I think in that respect, we do need to be thinking about, we do need to encourage the Pentagon. I'm not trying to defend the air sea battle concept that the Pentagon trots out, you know, on the whole. But what I am saying is that I think that when we think about this debate, what we really need to see this debate as is, does the United States, can the United States really sustain its traditional way of ordering, you know, the geopolitical environment in East Asia if it doesn't have the degree of military superiority in maritime Asia that it has had since 1945? So to me, the real argument is, do we have some kind of, you know, do we basically try to maintain primacy, which is something that Aaron's been really concerned with, and therefore, you know, invest in the military capabilities needed for that? Or do we maybe acknowledge reality, as some would say, or, you know, acknowledge that going to battle with the Chinese would be too dangerous? But then do we shift our geopolitics? And so what I think is we can't, you know, the idea that you can do something like the offshore control and have the traditional way of ordering things in the Asia Pacific that the Americans have done since 1945 is a fallacy. So, you know, I think it's a relatively minor point in the context of Adelphi, with which I really wholly agree, but I think it's also a significant one. You know, in terms of Aaron's prescriptions, I think they're sound, they're realistic. I think he brings up, you know, important you know, considerations of cost, of the necessity of restraint. You know, when he discusses mobile systems, it could be an endless sinkhole of investment. You know, we do have a lot of other things we need to do, and there are sort of, air sea battle doesn't mean that you need to be able to do everything in China. It just means you're prepared to do it and resource it. You know, so on the whole, I think my differences are fairly minor, but again, a significant one that I hope percolates out in the debate, even as Aaron's Adelphi, I think, really sets the framework. I hope this sort of slight sort of Thomistic revision will make its way, and I don't want to challenge the authority, but just amend it a little bit. But with that, it's a real honor to be up here with Aaron, and so thanks for your attention.
All right, well, thank you both. It was certainly a lot of material to cover, and thank you for doing such a good job of condensing your book and Bridge for your comments. I know there are going to be lots of questions from the floor. We'll try and take a few at a time, so we give each speaker an opportunity to reply to what's most pertinent to them. Just ask you raise your hand, get the microphone, introduce yourself, and state your affiliation, and we'll start with Robert.
Hi, I'm Robert Haddock. I'm a research contractor at Special Operations Command, and I have my own book coming out on this topic in a couple months. So I'd like to talk about, or ask a question about deterrence. First, how would you recommend we go about trying to discern what exactly is required or how the Chinese leadership thinks about things and what is required to deter them, because deterrence is in the mind of the adversary. And then related to that, if we're contemplating various concepts and approaches and so forth to achieve deterrence or maintain deterrence in the region, how fully fleshed out do these concepts and plans need to be? Do they need to be a detailed war plan orange or something more vague than that in order to achieve the first question that I asked? And then finally, also related to this is how much of capabilities within these concepts have to be displayed in order to make the concepts credible? Thank you.
So that was 3 questions in one. I would just possibly add into the mix what role you see the economic ties between these 2 countries as a sort of deterrent as well. Maybe similar to the nuclear issue, right, where it'd be too costly for either side. So if you want to take either of those questions.
Thank you. You've put your finger on what to me is the central issue. And for that reason, I'm not going to answer you directly because it's too big and complicated a question, or it's too important a question to give a premature answer to, is what I really want to say. And here, just to draw a parallel, which I do at the very end of the book, to the Cold War. The United States in the 1970s, as you know, developed a number of different approaches: air-land battle, maritime strategy, SDI to some degree, which turned out to have a disproportionate effect on Soviet calculations of American capabilities, and probably contributed not only to the maintenance of deterrence at a time when in other ways the balance was shifting in the Soviet Union's favor, but conceivably also contributed to the end of the Cold War by demoralizing them and making them decide that the game was over. We were able to do that because of what, again, in retrospect, appears to be a remarkable confluence of technological development and intelligence insight. And it was not just a question of getting a few sources in the right places, although we now know that that was the case. But it was the result of long effort to study and to try to understand how the Soviets assessed the military balance. And sitting in the back of the room is Jeff McKittrick, who was at that assessment when some of this work was going on. It took the better part of a couple decades, really, of very careful study, trying to take very seriously the ways in which the Soviets thought, plus some luck, to really get to the point where we felt we understood adequately the calculations they did, and therefore were confident that if we did certain things, we would influence their judgment of the balance. We're kind of coming into this story now. We're stepping into the thick of this now very vigorous ongoing competition without that level of understanding of the judgments, I submit. I know people have been studying this and so on. It's not like we weren't paying attention, but the level of resources devoted to this and the complexity of the problem, in part because Chinese seem in certain respects to think very differently about these problems than we do, in part because they seem to be very good at concealing what they really think, is one that I think should be a source of some caution. We can't wait for 20 years to figure that out or get a lucky break and get access to all says, if we do X, they will do Y. Immediate question is, how do you know? How do you know what they think? Just because of what they say, how do you know that what they say is really what they think? So that is not a real answer to your question, but I would say, I guess, as a subsidiary part of that. We do know some things, and we know more than some things. We know a lot. There's a lot of information that's available, and there's an ongoing debate and discussion in the Chinese system that spills out now into the open, which I think they control and manipulate in various ways, but is nonetheless revealing. And some of that, I think, is what it appears to be. I mentioned the threat of a blockade. Hu Jintao talked about the Malacca dilemma. The Chinese have invested enormous sums of money in developing what don't appear to be very economical infrastructure, pipelines, and so on, to allow them to get around possibly constricted waterways. What that says to me is, whether they're right or not, they're worried about this problem, and they're taking it seriously. And they're sinking a lot of money into stuff that might otherwise go somewhere else. So to me, that suggests that there is something that might be able to influence. There are other things. The most recent, last year's 2013 Chinese military power statement has a very interesting box with these little highlights that somebody drops in there, which I have not seen before, maybe others are aware of it, but says, beginning in the 1990s, the Chinese began to make enormous, this was not the word, very substantial investments in modernizing and expanding their underground facilities. So they're pouring a lot of concrete. They're worried about, it seems, conventional precision strike. They're investing a lot in defenses. And there, too, there may be something to pay attention. As far as the economic ties, obviously it's very important. But the ones, I'm not telling tales out of school because I don't know who the commenter was, but the one struggle I had in the editing of the book was that somebody kept saying, oh, you know, I'm caricaturing what they said, but basically, oh, this would never happen because it would, the world economy would come to a grinding halt. Well, that might be true, but it doesn't mean that it would not happen. And stepping back from that, how one side or the other or both might seek to manipulate those fears and those perceptions is a very important part of this ongoing game. If we say, you know, we're really worried that we borrow so much money from China that they're going to have leverage over us, they probably are more likely to think they have leverage over us. If we say, you know, if they tried to use that, they'd hurt themselves more than they would hurt us, that probably reduces this positions of those who would argue it wasn't the Chinese system. So the deterrence issue is central. Understanding how the other guy thinks is the key, and we're behind.
Yeah, two interesting questions, and I think, you know, pretty much basically agree with everything Aaron said. But I mean, you know, on your point about do we need to have real plans, I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think the basic logic is that whatever one's position about, you know, what the future of China is, what its likely kind of strategic outlook is going to be, et cetera, is better off if we are strong and we are seen to be strong, and, you know, strong or capable are the same thing, right? And the discernible perception that the United States has capabilities and the plans to employ them, not to mention the intent, and can do so in ways that would achieve our aims is likely to you know, deter China, but it's also likely to induce more constructive or restrained behavior, right? I mean, if you're in a call it the standing committee discussion, and you say, well, we could try that, but we know that the Americans have a plan for that, and actually they could actually do it, and it would, you know, it would hurt us more than them. You know, that's going to have an effect, and I mean, in a sense, conventional deterrence in particular, but nuclear deterrence as well. You know, it really rests on the ability, you know, the perception that it's credible, and I think that gets to Aaron's second point, which I think you were exactly right about, the sort of the who wins in a game of chicken. I was very struck reading, I think last year, Frank Gavin, who's a professor up at MIT, brilliant kind of historian, political scientist, you know, has a really good exposition of the Cold War and how the two sides deliberately were playing this game of chicken, seeing who was going to come out better, and that how it happened repeatedly, particularly over the Berlin crisis into Cuba. And there was actually discussions that he cited, I think are also in Fred Kemp's book about Berlin '61, where Khrushchev is discussing with the Politburo the precise likelihood of nuclear war coming about from a certain action they were taking in Berlin. It might be the construction of the wall, but they're arguing about whether it's a 5% chance or a 10% chance, and 5% might be okay and 10% wouldn't be. So it's a similar thing with economics, right? I mean, if we're both over a barrel, the guy who blinks first loses. So it becomes, a question of will. And, the other thing with the economic argument is obviously it's true, and so that does impose a cautionary break on things. But, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So if you take that argument, what happens if the economy is not going so well and creates incentives for instance, the Chinese government, which is certainly going to face economic challenges and headwinds and maybe worse? What if the incentives become different? Because economic, and I think the academic literature supports this, the economic incentives are not always for peace. Saddam Hussein in 1990 did not have an economic incentive for peace. So I think we should be aware of the economic implications for strategic issues and the general interstate relations, but we shouldn't think that they're all in a direction of peace.
Great, let's take a few more questions from the floor. I see 3 hands on this side of the room, so I want to start in the back and make our way forward.
Gene Germanovich, consultant to the Marine Corps. I find it interesting that Taiwan hasn't come up yet, and was wondering where the state of Sino-Taiwanese relations factors in within your paradigm.
Mike Macetic, I don't know whether you have seen the Barry Pavel, Robert Manning piece, which is mainly about nuclear deterrence, but they make the point that, say post-Cuba anyway, that there was much more transparency between the United States and the Soviet Union, whereas China seems to regard transparency as a reward rather than a reward for good behavior rather than a actual condition, which leads me partly to the question, do you think that they understand, or has the United States adequately made clear to them what damage, I'm talking conventional now, what damage we could do to their forces in some kind of a conflict?
Thanks, Bob Peters from National Defense University. A terrific book. I devoured it in the course of an afternoon. We decide the sheer amount of time it takes to go from concept development to a level 1 plan IPR Charlie, an enormous amount of time in playing takes. But I would offer that outside of Omaha, that the art of theater nuclear planning is a dead art when you get out to combatant commands. And if you do not have the ability to conceptualize theater nuclear operations, our ability to manage an escalatory crisis at a certain point in the conflict will crumble. And I'm not sure we've really tackled that problem yet.
Okay, great. So questions about Taiwan's role in potential air-sea battle, the issue of transparency, which is certainly key. Has the U.S. clearly stated what its conventional forces would be capable of, and then managing a nuclear response.
It's just on Taiwan briefly. At one time, the view of many people in the United States was that all China cared about was Taiwan, and I think that increasingly is obviously not the case. But it does seem to me that Taiwan was like the grain of sand around which the pearl formed. It was the original problem that the Chinese focused on when they were worrying about how they might counter American power projection capabilities. So in my view, the turning point in the story, both from the American and I think from the Chinese perspective too, is the 95-96 Taiwan Straits crisis. It's when people in the U.S., I think, began to focus more seriously on China's potential military competitor, and also began to focus more seriously on the challenge posed by large numbers of conventional precision weapons. And it does seem also to have contributed to further intensification of a discussion in China that was already going on, probably was kicked off by 1991, the first Gulf War. But Taiwan is now one of several possible flashpoints that could lead to a confrontation between the United States and China. Whether we think the likelihood of that is going up or down is perhaps left for another day. On the transparency, just 2 quick thoughts. One, the way in which China has talked about and, from what we know, procured and deployed nuclear weapons suggests that they think about their utility in a way that's different than powers and different than the Soviets. In particular, they seem to have been content for quite a long time with a relatively small, or quite small, force of nuclear weapons capable of striking the United States, and seemingly confident that that small force was sufficient to deter the United States, presumably from doing a variety of things against China. Whether that thinking is changing, or whether the Chinese estimate of what's necessary in order to maintain that sort of minimal level of deterrent capacity is an ongoing debate, but certainly they are expanding to some degree and also doing things to increase the survivability of their nuclear forces. But they don't seem to be moving dramatically away from that, at least not to my knowledge. As far as their understanding of what U.S. conventional forces could do, this is something on which they've obsessively focused. I think that they study very carefully, and maybe they exaggerate in some ways, but they've been very interested in studying all the conflicts in which not only the United States, but other advanced industrial powers like Britain. There's a whole literature, Chinese literature on the Falklands War. So they're very close students of what we can do. I'm more concerned actually on the other side of that equation. How well do they understand the capabilities of their own systems? And this gets back to the issue of perception, misperception, calculation, miscalculation. And kind of an unusual situation, and maybe it's an unprecedented. Major military power, which is in the process of fielding military systems of a sort that no one in that country has ever used, and some of which no one anywhere has ever used. And not only that, a military leadership which, I think, with the possible exception of a handful of elderly generals, has never seen a shot fired in anger. So what does that mean for their thinking about the utility of their forces and their ability to conduct operations? You can tell that story any way you like, and in particular, you can say, you can speculate that this makes people very cautious. Maybe it makes the political leaders very cautious, even if the military guys are very excited. But it could be just the opposite. It could be that people really believe that they push the button, things are going to work just as smoothly as they anticipate. And unfortunately, I think historically, other countries have tended to err on that side. There are more examples of people thinking it was all going to go wonderfully. But the gap between their experience and their use of these systems and the sophistication of those systems and their significance for us is very large. Unfortunately, in this country, we've been fighting wars on more or less regular basis for the last 20 years. So we have ample experience, maybe not in the right kinds of conflict, but so I worry about that. The theory of nuclear operations, and this gets back to the question of what role nuclear weapons might play. I say I'm not current on the thinking in the U.S. military on this issue, but certainly during the Cold War, and nothing we have said that I'm aware of would obviate this. The assumption has been that if conventional means were insufficient to achieve our objectives in defending our allies, protecting our interests, we would hold open the possibility of escalating to the use of nuclear weapons. Nothing we've said suggests otherwise. We haven't signed a no first use pledge, and I don't think it's likely that we would. How we would do that, and getting back to the question of what kind of capabilities you would need, what sorts of capabilities you would want to be able to deploy in order to make more plausible the possibility that you might do this, I think is going to be an increasingly important question, because this is not just a competition between conventional forces.
No, excellent questions. On Taiwan, the first point is, I think the other way would be Taiwan is the canary in the coal mine to some extent. I mean, as Aaron said, a few years ago, people were saying they were only focused on it. It's implausible that they will, the Chinese will be able to figure out how to do this anytime soon. And now last year you had the Taiwan Ministry of National Defense say that they thought by 2020 the United States would not be able to counter-intervene, would not be able to block a PRC move, military moves against Taiwan. And the PRC still hasn't solved some of the problems, for instance, amphibious, lift or amphibious, logistics and so forth. But my understanding is they are working on those problems. So the Taiwan problem is very severe, but it's gone under the radar because of the political sort of quiescence that's followed from President Ma's elections. But that could change quite quickly if the DPP is elected or if something else happens. I think that Taiwan is always got to be treated delicately by the United States. We do not want to cause unnecessary friction with China. We also don't want to kind of let Taiwan go or abandon Taiwan, or which would have not only sort of moral problems but sort of strategic repercussions of great significance. I think the most important thing that Taiwan can do is, first of all, it can do more. Taiwan's defense spending and procurement has been pretty disappointing, as I understand it. And it could, I think it should focus on capabilities that complicate and worsen China's strategic problem certainly in conquering Taiwan, but also in harassing or molesting it. And that gets at a broader issue of this sort of hedgehogs or porcupines or whatever you want to call it, which again is not an alternative to air-sea battle, as a supplement. One of the things American defense strategy and also defense engagement should be more oriented towards is enabling our allies and partners and others in the region to create little A2AD bubbles of their own to make Chinese power projection more difficult. So, this is something that some other people, Evan Montgomery, whose work I commend to all of you, has been thinking about this, Jim Thomas at CSBA. So, I think Taiwan is a tricky political situation, but, and I actually think really merits more discussion in the broader policy discussion. To Mike, your question about Barry and Bob's article, I mean, I've talked about this with Bob quite a lot, and without success. First of all, I think Bob, in that article and elsewhere, there's a little bit of an idealization of the Cold War. I was not an adult in the Cold War, but having talked to people who were, whom I trust, it was not always so easy. And I think, even after the sort of resolution of issues in the European theater, quote unquote resolution, even sort of after the sort of cooling down of the Cold War, warming up the Cold War, after the sort of resolution of the Berlin issue, there were still proxy wars. There was, very serious stability problems, the Pershing deployments, the Glickums. So I think, we should be very careful about saying the Cold War was simple or that there were all these nice mechanisms for managing rivalry. That only really happened when the Soviet Union fundamentally changed its attitude under Gorbachev. I think that Bob, has sort of bought into the anti-air-sea battle argument, and not you, Bob. Sorry, not you, Bob Peters. Bob Manning has, as my understanding, has bought into the anti-air-sea battle argument that some others are offering, and so I think he's tending to. People in that school are tending, or that from that perspective, are tending to see the fundamental problem as one of reassuring China and China reassuring us, and that the issue is sort of managing the instability and stability paradox and so forth. That is obviously important, no question. And I participate in Track 2 and Track 1.5 dialogues. I believe in that. It's important. I believe we should try to engage in arms control with the Chinese. But to me, a major part, and probably the primary part, is straight deterrence. I don't think this is fundamentally a function of misunderstanding. This is classic strategic interaction. And so I see things like air-sea battle that demonstrate strength and capability, which should be used with care and restraint, but which the capability should be there, are more important. And I think Aaron's right, in that the Chinese understand it, but as with, I think, probably the Soviets, it was also true that there was a mixture of arrogance and insecurity. The Soviets sort of, beat their chests, and then they were terrified of the Pershing missile. In the same way the Chinese seem to, they're very scared of precision strike and missile defense, but then they're also sort of, they trot out pictures of the DF-21D. So, it's complicated. It's not one thing or the other. It's a mixture of issues. Bob Peters, your point about theater nuclear planning is right on. It's a major issue and clearly has been a huge lacuna in American military planning and part of the general decay of nuclear focus and attention, which has been far worse outside of the confines of STRATCOM and those specific, quote-unquote, siloed areas of the military that are dedicated to them, which have themselves decayed, as we've seen with the ICBM force. I have heard anecdotally that things have improved a little bit. I am skeptical. I think that this is part of the kind of cultural shift that is going to happen, where you are going to have to get at least some portion of military officers who are not shunted off to one side to be thinking seriously about the problems of escalation and limiting conflict, which include the nuclear dimension. And the pointy end of the planning spear of that point that I'm making is theater nuclear planning, which I hope gets better, but I think we have a long way to go.
That was amazing. I apologize. We usually try to end things right on the hour, but given the importance of this issue, I thought we could run over a few minutes. So I apologize. I'm not ending on time, but would like to ask you to join me in thanking our excellent panelists for